Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
No news on the radio, so how did he hear what happened? That's number one. And number two, thinking about Vayvakesh laharog et Moshe. So was he asking to kill Moshe by himself or have somebody else do it? What does it mean that he asked? If he wanted to kill Moshe, then he would have the sword and kill him. But Vayevakesh, maybe he asked somebody else or hand Moshe over to somebody to kill him. So he was...
Great questions. I'm just going to pause 1 second because welcome Norm Gar, who's our podcast co-master at Temple Beth Am. I tried to record on Facebook, but it was not working several times I did it. So I am recording it on my computer, but I started recording it too late. So I can now restart the concept saying, hi everyone, this is the Rashi Class. We're on chapter 2 of the book of Shemot, verse 15, but it would not go to Facebook today. Good. So just to linger on the two things that Berit said, we are told that Pharaoh learns what happened, but we have no clue how he figured it out. Rashi will definitely address that question in his own way. And you're focusing more on that question of Vayevakesh. What does it mean for a melech levakesh? And Rashi is going to have his own interesting answer to that. Good. Diane, Larry, Rick, and Ilan, more questions. Ilan and I, who are in very good moods today. Hamevin Yavin.
So, you went first. Yeah. Oh. So the Moshe immediately made me think about the scene that takes place a little bit further on with Tzipporah and Moshe, and they're returning to Egypt, and God Mivakesh to kill Moshe. Kind of a bad word.
Yeah, let's look at that. That's a good reference. That is
verse 25. What is it? Chapter 6, I think. No, that's not right. Chapter 4. Sorry.
So the scene to which Diane is referring is a crazy scene that only lasts 2 verses, and we're going to spend a long time on that when we get there. So you want to page ahead to chapter 4, verse 24.
Right.
It's page Nun Aleph in our books. So they're going back to Egypt, Tzipporah and Moshe and child. Vayehi v'derech b'malon. They were at the Hilton. They were on the way in a lodging. Vayivkeshehu Adonai. God meets him being Moshe. Vayevakesh hamito. Right? Similar phrasing. So instead of laharog, which is the phrase that we have to kill, here it's lahamit, right? So those mean the same thing, but they're different words. Lahamit means to make dead. It's the he feel of dead, to make someone dead. Laharog is just to murder, right? And God requests to kill Moshe, right? Crazy little scene. And we'll linger on it. But what you're pointing out, I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that not only is there a laharog in the mouth or associated with a pharaoh, a levakesh associated with a pharaoh, but there's a levakesh associated with a god. So what does it mean for a pharaoh and a god, levakesh, making a request, right? Good. So it might be that the best way of handling that in English is the way that, either the way that Norm read or misread the translation. He sought, he intended to, or he thought, he had in his mind to. Everett Fox translates the verse, Pharaoh heard of this matter and sought to kill Moshe, which works because levakesh does mean to seek out, right? And sought here means to seek out in the sense of intending. But Moshe fled from Pharaoh's face and settled in the land of Midian. He sat down by a well. Notice, by the way, that Everett Fox translates the 2 consecutive verbs that are the same with different English words. And that we're going to pick up when we get to Rashi. He settled in the land of Midian, Vayeshev, and he sat down by a well, Vayeshev. Same exact word. Onkelos translates the exact same word in Aramaic, Vayetiv, and we're going to figure out how those 2 things might be different. Great. Thank you for that, Diane. Larry, 2 for 1.
First of all, I'm blown away by my wife. How she found that, I don't know. But I'm always blown away by my wife. You've all gone over almost all the things that I wanted to say, including the Vayeshev, which is translated in different ways, including the fact that the Pharaoh Levakesh, he requests, why wasn't it commanded? So I'll ask the question, why didn't Pharaoh command as opposed to request? I want to just point out the sparseness of the whole story. We've gone in 5 verses, I guess, from 11 to 15, from Moses seeing the struggle between 2 Jews, intervening between an Egyptian and a Jew, killing the Egyptian, seeing the struggle between 2 Jews, and now this scene. But I do want to do one thing originally no one's done. I want to connect verse 14, the end of verse 14, where Moshe Vayomar, Moses says, Achen noda hadavar, I'm not going to stop, Vayishma paro et hadavar hazeh. So the davar is the davar, that's clearly connected. And Moses says, it's known, however it's known, which we talked about last time, must be the way that Pharaoh has actually heard it. So the knowing and the hearing have to also be connected.
Yeah, great. So I do think that we're supposed to, as a reader, connect those 2 davars. Even so, the exact definition of what that davar is remains ambiguous, but they're supposed to be the same davar. And yes, that Moshe's rumination to himself, this must be known. His fear of how it became known must be the way that Pharaoh knows, although Rashi is going to give a slightly different answer. And Moshe's fear about how it was known, or the evidence that it was known to Moshe, is that people are talking about it, right? People are talking about it because he happens to meet 2 Jews who happen to, at least one of whom already knows the story. Okay, great. We'll linger for 1 second. If you look at the Aramaic of Onkelos, he had a choice in translating Vayevakesh in Aramaic in a way that either strengthens or weakens this notion of a request, because Vayevakesh can be seek, not only ask. He goes the direction of ask, request. He translates Vayevakesh as uba'e. Bet ayin yud in Aramaic means to ask, to need, to make a request of something. It's used in Talmud all the time to say that one rabbi asked of another, right? And it has to do with needing something you don't have, information or a thing. So it's interesting that he translates that verb in a way that suggests that, yes, the Pharaoh had to ask for this to be done rather than command it. Rick, Ilan, Matt, Vered, Marshall, Stevie, Barbara. Eventually we will get to a Rashi, maybe. Rick. Where are you, DJ?
Sorry, I didn't unmute. You got me?
Got you.
Okay. It's an angel midrash. Rabbi Janai asked the question, if you want a question. This is from Midrash Rabbah, Exodus chapter 1, verse or 131, entry 31, I guess. And Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh. So said Rabbi Janai, is it possible for a man to escape from a king? No. But when they seized Moses and condemned him to be beheaded, an angel from heaven descended in the form of Moses. And while they seized the angel, meanwhile Moses escaped.
Sorry, hold on.
Oh, can you hear me? Oh, good. Are we still going? Hello? Hello?
Yes, sorry, just someone was calling in on my FaceTime, so I muted myself for a second so it didn't overwhelm you. Keep going.
So that was it, that an angel came down and they did a Mission Impossible kind of disguise on the angel. So the Pharaoh's troops captured Moses and captured the angel, and then Moses got away. So that's it.
Thank you, Rick. That does add a nice angelic layer to it. Elon, first, Mazel Tov. Second, what's your question?
Thank you. And I wanted to just tell you how much I like this class, because I'm postponing my baseball marathon by half an hour to be here. So we have 13 hours of baseball in front of us. But anyway, the phrase that
only three of those hours matter. Only 3 of those hours matter.
The phrase that I want to talk about is Mipnei Pharaoh. Okay. So it could have read Vayivrach Moshe mi Paro or mi Mitzrayim but it says specifically mipnei. And to me, that phrase is very personal. It's not just that he left Egypt or left Pharaoh as the ruler. He left from his face, right? And maybe and to me, that when you talk about being in somebody's face, that's a much more personal thing, and it may give us some insight as to how Pharaoh reacts subsequently.
That's wonderful, Ilan, particularly because in our scene, he's actually not yet in the face of Pharaoh, but he's going to be. Right, so your question actually helps us read that phrase as a bit of a premonition. There's going to be so many moments where he's actually nipnei paro and then leaves his presence and comes back in. Here, he's not yet. So here the meaning clearly is quote unquote just he fled away, but the mipnei almost is presaging the intimacy that they're going the conflictual intimacy they're going to share. Interestingly, here, whereas Onkelos doubled down on the specificity of vayavakesh, meaning really to ask, here he translates mipnei more blandly. He doesn't turn mipnei into the Aramaic from the face of. He just turns mipnei in the Aramaic to min kadam, like he left from before Pharaoh. Meaning he went away. So he doesn't carry over the panim, the face part of it, into the Aramaic. But I really love that. I love that point and highlighting that face-to-face quality of their not yet encounter. Great, Matt. Sorry, Matt. I muted you right when you unmuted yourself, so you have to unmute yourself again.
Okay, are we there?
Yes, we're there.
Okay, so about the vacation made me think of, I can't remember where this is from, but the phrase, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest? Is that from The Lion in Winter or something? But basically, an autocratic king doesn't need really to order the death of anybody. You can just think about it and suggest it. And the same applies to God in that incident that Diane mentioned 2 chapters on. Certainly God doesn't need to order the angel to do it. It just sort of happens. And he suggests it and it happens.
Right.
And I want to put in a plug for my new horror movie that's going to appear on streaming online called Bridegroom of Blood.
You'll have to wait a few more chapters of that one. Right, Matt, and that's the thing. So it either leaves the reader with really one or two main options here. One, levakesh can mean something else besides request, or we've got to figure out the circumstance under which it might make sense for a pharaoh to have to make a request, and the particular midrash that Rashi culls to give the answer is wonderful, fanciful but wonderful. But he's responding to that very tension, that verb. Okay. We're breaking records here for hands up for questions that need to be asked in the verse. Let me first go to those who are on their first round of questions for this verse. Stevie, Barbara, Susan, Barry, Joel.
Okay. So I meant to lower my hand because I was mostly going to say what Larry already said. But the other thing I wanted to say was Vakesh, just, because of laning. What it reminded me of was the Megillah that Haman, right? By Vakeshaman Lashmid at Kol Yodim, that he instead of just dealing with Mordechai, he planned or sought or something to deal with all the Jews. And so I guess it could involve sort of an internal action instead of a public action at the moment, but certainly like a serious decision being made.
Great. And kol hakavod for like a laner question. Sometimes when you're a laner, as Stevie is, you make word associations because phrases are just in your mind more because you've spent so many hours thinking about them and memorizing them. So right. So Haman's stance vis-a-vis the Jews is a bakasha. There, it actually might have been more of a bakasha because he has to make the request of the king, right? So,
but not in that verse. Yeah.
Correct. Correct. Not in that specific verse. Great. Barbara. All right, we can hear you.
It's a little weird to me in this phrase at the end. He dwelt, which means he lived in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do when you're living in a land, but to point out that he that he sat down by a well is bizarre to me.
Great. I'm so glad you asked that question, because we translated it because the words are easy, but we didn't yet linger on that. Why did he sit by a well? But you're asking a meta question. Why is it relevant to us that he sat by a well? Right? Those are two different questions. Why did he well there? But why is it significant? It might be percolating in some people's minds as we think about the book of Breshit, why it might have been significant that the first place that Moshe goes is to a well, and that's I'm giving a little bit of a teaser to Rashi's answer, right? Correct. Not.
Well, actually, if he dwelt there, it sounds like he was there for a while. I mean, he fled from Pharaoh, and then he was there for a while, and then he suddenly sat down at a well.
Yeah, and great comment by Diane and Larry that it's not al be'er, by a well, but the well. So what's the of the well? Great. All right, Susan, Barry, Joel, and then maybe we'll pause for a bit and actually read some of the Rashi. Susan.
I just want to go back to Elon's comment. I want to thank him for that. And my phone's ringing. Oh, God. Because the Mibnei Pharaoh it's also, I mean, if we're to believe The Prince of Egypt, the movie, he was like a son in the house. It wasn't just that he left from his face, but he really did kind of, Pharaoh may have experienced it like a father figure, like he left his family unit.
Great. So that the intimacy is both kind of a premonition of the interaction the two of them are going to have later on, but it also suggests that, right, at this point, he's a Ben Bayit in that house, right? He's the scion, or he's an adopted son or something. Wonderful. Joel.
I want to talk about the word milifnei, and since you went to all the trouble of scheduling it so we have this exact verse the first week after Yom Kippur, I just want to point out that it's the same word that Yonah barach mipnei Hashem.
Great, very good. Right,
so good planning. I congratulate.
Well, listen, you got to give me some credit, Joel. The fleeing from the face of is the exact phrase. It is indeed the exact phrase that it describes Jonah's wanting to get out of the job of being a prophet. Whereas, interestingly, here, and just thinking about this in real time, it's Moshe's fleeing from Pharaoh that sends him on the journey of being a prophet, right? So actually, it's the same phrase, but in the opposite prophetic directions. Barry.
So I'm also spurred on by Elon's pointing out mipnei, and now a lot of this is coming clear to me. Moshe is going through a death experience. He has killed the Egyptian. He's found out he's killed the Egyptian. He fears for his life. He is fleeing to a new identity. He's fleeing from what he was and to become who he is. It's a meta transition that he must go through. Jonah similarly had to go through when he goes down to sleep in the hold, it's through a near-death experience, becomes transformed through the next process. Moshe is going through a death through the next space of his life experience. That's the main thing.
Thank you, Barry. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to just skip the next two hands for a second. Go back to Norm and start reading the Rashi. I'm going to leave the screen for a second because in the half an hour this class has begun, this office has become stifling. I just need to turn on the air conditioning because I'm sweating bullets here. But Norm, I can hear you. But Norm, please start reading on Vayishma Paro.
Vayishma Paro, Haim Hilshinu Olav.
How to translate that?
We translate that, and Pharaoh heard it. They denounced him, or they slandered him. They told about him. And I would add that Zilberman adds that the they is Dasan and Aviram.
And that's also in this, in the Sepharia.
And while you're sitting down, I will add that the reason he goes to the well is that when you want to meet somebody, you go where the single people are to be found.
Okay, so we'll get back to that later. Rashi very tersely answers the question of that we raised. How did he know? They snitched, right? They lahalshin is to be an informer, and it's actually a loaded term in Jewish tradition. I think we mentioned this at least one of the last times we spoke about this. That is the 19th blessing of the Shemona Esrei. It's the blessing that turns the Shemona Esrei into a Chasrei, 18 blessings into 19. Do not give informers any kind of hope that what they're going to do is going to be rewarded. Here it might just be a plain use of the verb that they told, they tattled on Moshe. My question for you is not who do you think the Haim is? Who do you think Rashi thinks the Haim is, such that Rashi doesn't have to identify the Haim? Who's the they? Anyone can answer that. Do you remember who Rashi identified? Datan and Aviram, right? So Rashi had associated the two men who were scuffling with each other, with whom Moshe has this interaction, as Datan and Aviram, the same people who are going to be part of Korach's rebellion later on. And Rashi assumes that we read Rashi, right? Slightly self-referential. So when he says Haim, he assumes that we remember that the Haim is Datan Aviram, which would be easier to remember if we just were reading it more quickly, because it's only a few verses ago. So it's pretty clear. And if you look at least in our version, footnote 67 resolves that for us. Datan Aviram, based on the same Tanchuma text that Rashi quoted earlier. Okay. Notice also that in Rashi is doing one thing here explicitly, and I think one thing here subtly. The explicit thing is answering the question as to how Pharaoh knew, and the answer is that these two guys told the tale. The subtle thing is he's reinforcing again that Moshe is recognizing that amongst the Israelites there are malshinim, there are informers, there are people who are violating the principle of not doing that very thing and getting your own fellow in trouble, and once again setting the tone for a conflictual relationship between Moshe and the very people he's going to redeem from slavery. Good. So that's that on Vayishma Paro. Let's read one more Rashi, and then we'll pause to see if there are any more questions or comments. Vayivakesh laharog et Moshe.
Vayivakesh laharog es Moshe. Mesor lekusti nor v'hornu v'lo sholta vo charev. And he sought to slay Moses. He handed him over to the executioners to slay him, but the sword proved powerless against him. It is to this that Moshe referred when he said, and he delivered me from Pharaoh's sword.
Okay, so I'm going to share a screen with you for a second, so we see how Jastro translates kostinar. I saw it in my trying to figure out what might be the linguistic connection. It might be from the word question. You see, the first thing he says is a questionarius, but it's understood a kustinar was a torturer or an executioner. So you know how like an interrogation, that word can be both to ask something just interrogatively, but also can mean to interrogate for the purpose of getting information out, and torture. Sometimes it can be a euphemism for torture. So this word kustinar is probably related to that etymologically, that it's from the word from which we get question, but it meant to question, to get a confession out of in order to execute, right? So that's, I think, anything else he says in there?
Yeah, he says.
Yeah, so then he gives a bunch of different examples, but that's that word, kustinar, okay? So think of it as.
He specifically says the sword rebounded from Moshe's neck against that of his executioner, and the executioner was killed.
Right. So he gives us, we used to call that a Jastro jackpot when you're looking up a word in Jastro, and the example that Jastro uses is either the exact text or a similar text that you're reading. It's not the exact text here. That source comes from Yerushalmi Brachot, which is the Palestinian Talmud, which is not the specific source that's being quoted here, but as you know, many midrashim appear in many different places. Okay, so going back to the Rashi, what does it mean? This is now answering the question how it can be that a pharaoh would need to ask, right, as opposed to command. So what's his answer? That he he had passed him over to the executioner. So we assume that the he who had passed him over is Pharaoh. The him is Moshe. He had passed Moshe, meaning in the verse we have this notion that Moshe is nervous that Pharaoh found out and flees. In the Midrash, not only was it found out, he was arrested, he was indicted, he was tried, he was sent to his sentence. He had been passed over to the questioner, to the executioner, lahargo, to actually kill him. Velo shalta bo hacherav. And there's some people who read this to be either kind of miraculously or by happenstance. Either, right, it's like a moment where Abraham's hand is over Yitzchak and an angel interrupts him, and the executioner is about to decapitate Moshe, God forbid, and it hasn't happened yet. Or the timing is that he hadn't gotten to the exact act, right? And so how is this a resolution to the question of Vayavakesh laharog et Moshe? Because all of this is not just an expansive story. Rashi trying to answer the question. You, reader, are wondering how it can be that a pharaoh would have to ask, or that the verb to ask makes sense in this context. How is what he's saying here an answer to that? Anyone?
It's an order.
Any thoughts? If you have a thought, unmute and share it.
I think you said it already. He had Moshe. He was asking his executioner to take over.
Right. So the Midrash that Rashi is quoting is reading the Bakasha not as permission, because a king does not do that. But basically, it's reading the Pharaoh is saying now, right? Like the sentence is over. He's in your hands, and I request that it happen this moment. Which is an easier sell than saying that he would have had to command it, because obviously he commanded it, but he's specifically asking it happens now. That's how close, according to Midrash, Moshe came to being killed. That's how close. Just notice all the implications, that none of this redemption ever happens. The knife was above his neck. This Midrash imagines Moshe in a Yitzchakian position on the altar, about to be executed, and it doesn't happen. It's fascinating, right? Barry, yes, please.
Yeah, so similarly, as we can posit, Yitzhak having gone through some major mental psychological change at that moment, that way Abraham goes one way, he goes the other. What happens to Yitzhak's life? His life is altered. Similarly, in this moment, through this whole process, with all this death stuff, Moshe is going through a significant change, and that's the mipnei.
Yeah. And Moshe is most often compared to, amongst the patriarchs, Yosef, right? Being in the Pharaoh's household and being a redeemer and a savior. And if I go back to my own Rosh Hashanah sermon, self-referentially, a mashbir, a one who provides. Here, there is an inevitable association, an inexorable association between Moshe and Yitzchak, right? And what wouldn't have taken place had the execution actually gone through in the moment that Pharaoh requested that it happen, right? Vered, Norm, Marshall, Diane, Larry. And then there's one more phrase in the Rashi that we haven't dealt with yet, but let's hear some thoughts. Vered, Bakasha. Okay, Shomi Motach. Vered. Do people hear Vered? I see that she's unmuted, but I can't hear her. Are you all hearing her? No?
She's away from her computer at this point.
Away from the computer, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Then let's go to Marshall.
I just wanted to go back to the Datan V'Aviram thing for a second, the first part of the Rashi. The Shemot Rabbah basically says, She'amdu Datan V'Aviram V'Hilshinu Alav. And I'm very interested in the first word, She'amdu. This was not a passive thing with them. They actually had to stand up, and then they went ahead and they were malshinim upon Moses. Yeah. So it seems to me they said, aha, we know Moses. How are you going to feel about us when we ally ourselves with Korah? So in response to the way you're going to treat us then, here's what we're going to do to you now.
Yeah, right. It's either pre-pay you back for what you're going to do to us then, or pre-earn the punishment we're going to get, right? It's one way, depending on who has the Ruach HaKodesh here. Right. Diane, Larry?
I only want...
The reason why that happens, folks, is sometimes when people are about to speak, I unmute, and the speaker unmutes at the same time, and an unmute plus an unmute equals a mute. Sorry, Larry.
So you mentioned that Rashi wants us to think about the Akedah. That's fine. But the text itself wants us to think about other things. And I know I'm jumping slightly ahead, but there's behind and ahead. The Yivrach was the fleeing, and I'm thinking of Jacob fleeing from Esav. And the Haber, the well, Haber, is making me think of all the different wells. There's the first well where the servant of Abraham encounters Rivka. Then there's the well where Jacob encounters the family of Lavan, of his family. There's the wells that Isaac, I forget who dug, that we read about just...
Isaac redigs the wells of Abraham.
Right. So the well wants us to think about these wells. And even though they're in different places, they're all the same well. I'm not going to go on from there, but there's a midrash there. If it hasn't already been written, someone needs to write it.
Right. Well, it's almost like you're suggesting, again, I want to put words in your mouth, but what you're saying evokes for me is that the well is less a specific well than the Platonic notion of well, right? And all that well has meant in Breshit. And Norm said something cute before, but Rashi is going to go in a similar direction without giving away too much of the story, which is, in addition, beyond the arguments that happen over wells in Breshit, the other thing that happens at wells are shidduchim. Marriages happen at wells, right? So the well might be asking the reader to think that very type of well where there are going to be shepherds and maiden and marriages, right? Great. So the Platonic well. Yes, Diane, please.
Yeah, so this is sort of a broad philosophical issue. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but if we start to look at the Akedah, where Yitzchak's life was, so to speak, hanging by a thread, and in this place where Moshe's life was hanging by a thread, and then a few verses later, the same thing, and so the fate of the Jewish people, or the Hebrews, or whatever, seems to hinge on, I don't know if we want to look at it as fate or God's hand in history, or I don't know, what is the kind of the Jewish view of I know this is probably a broader question for a long discussion, but of the hand that fate plays in all of this. Yeah.
So it is a very broad and important question. As far down as on the road I'll go right now is to say that one of the things that we've seen Rashi do for chapter after chapter after chapter is to impose a divine order upon what seems to just be natural and organic interactions between people, right? Which is a version of fate. It's this notion of things happening within a system that is beyond our ken, but it's still a system, right? That wonderful rabbinic dictum in Pirkei Avot, Hakol Safui, everything is foreseen, v'harashut biyado, but you still have the right in the moment to act the way you choose to act. So free will is not surrendered, but just so you know, your free will is happening within a system which already is somehow designed by the Holy One. So there's obviously many more things that can be said about that. There are dissertations that can be written on that. But I do think that Rashi wants us to, because of the way the Midrash thought about it, link things that are not obviously linked and imagine a divine through line through all of these encounters, right? I mean, think of how many times the Rashi attributed when Yosef was up or down or up to divine intent there, which is a version of the fate that Yosef was destined to live, whether or not he knew it was happening in real time. Sue, and then I want to deal with the last line of that Rashi.
Okay, I was waiting for you to unmute me, so we wouldn't hit the button together. And
whatever decision I make the wrong decision for each person. People I assume will unmute themselves. I don't unmute, and blah, 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 blah. Go ahead.
I like Diane's bit about the wells, even for, and I'm, it's kind of the obvious, but the wells are also they're kind of part of God's miracle to the Israelites, starting with Abraham, that Abraham seemed to be the only one who could find all the wells, dig all the wells, leave all the wells to Yaakov, and those wells propelled the story forward. And not only that, but, even today, we metaphorically talk about the wells. The wells themselves are like the presence of God in the desert. the sustaining and the without which nothing goes forward. And even now we talk about the wells of wells in relationship to God and sustenance, I think.
Right. And midrashically, who is the source of the well that is going to sustain the people in the desert when Moshe is leading them?
God. No.
It's always God, but God and who?
Miriam.
Miriam, right? So Miriam is the water giver. When Miriam dies, the well dries up, right? So, Habe'er could also be, pre-invoking Miriam into this scene as well, because Miriam is certainly going to be associated later with the Israelites being able to draw water throughout their entire time, right? About the water.
There's also been a nod here to, or we've nodded anyway, to when God, asks for Moshe's mavet, and we always relate that to the problem of the water and the rock and the missing well, essentially, because he's hitting the rock for the water. There's some thread here.
That's great. Yeah, my mind went to Miriam, but not to Moshe's upcoming complex interactions with water sources. Right, great. A lot going on there. And maybe all of that reinforces why it's ha-be'er and not be'er. So thank you, Diane, for pointing that out. Norm, if you're still, I know you read it, but I don't know if we dealt with the proof text. Rashi gives a proof text, or it's not really a proof text. It's more like he uses this midrash to resolve a upcoming issue or problem in Parshat Yitro. So he has here where am I? Hushan Amar. And that kind of, I'm going to paraphrase Rashi. That is what explains what Moshe says where? Chapter 18, verse 4. Okay, so everyone turn ahead to chapter 18, verse 4 of Shemot. It's in Parshat Yitro, the first few verses of Parshat Yitro.
It's a long way.
And there's a really strange phrase. When Yitro is being informed by Moshe of all that's happened in the Exodus story, right? Parshat Yitro is about the reunion between Moshe and Yitro. So if you actually pull back, it's on page Reish Kaf Chet in our books. If you go back to verse 3, actually, V'et Shnei Baneha, Zipporah's two sons come also, Asher Shema Achad Gershom, one of them is named Gershom, Ki Amar, because he had said, Ger Hayiti Be'eretz Nochriya, I was a stranger in a strange land, V'Shem Ha'achad Eliezer, the name of my second son, Yitro is being introduced to his grandson, is Eliezer. Excuse me.
Gesundheit.
Why is Moshe's second son called Eliezer? Ki Elohei Avi Be'ezri, the God of my father, my ancestor, was my help, was there to help me. When? Vayatzileni, and God saved me, Mecherev Paro, from Pharaoh's sword. So when we learn the name of Moshe's second son, we believe Eliezer, God help. It's Moshe's homage to God having been a saving power in his life. Without comparing it to our verse in the early part of Shemot, without the Midrash, this is symbolic. This is metaphorical. I was in the palace trying to request the freedom for the Israelites, and any time that that Pharaoh would have wanted to kill me, he could have. But it's not specific. But now we have a specificity to which to attach this. And look what Rashi says there. I'll just read this for time's sake. Rashi basically refers himself. Shegilu Datan v'Aviram. This is when Datan v'Aviram uncovered, revealed, al Devar HaMitzri, on Devar, Larry, Devar, on that thing regarding the Egyptian. Uvikesh. He in a wonderful way, he actually quotes the verb from the Torah about which we're asking right now. And he requested laharog at Moshe, to kill Moshe, which we're now supposed to understand as he actually made this specific request off of his head now. Na'aseh tzavarav ka'amud shel shayesh. In this version of the Midrash that Rashi does not quote in our verse, it's definitely not circumstantial or happenstance, it's miraculous. That Moshe's neck became like a pillar of shayesh. Know what shayesh is? Marble, right? So in this version of the Midrash, what happens is that the execution, the kostinar, was coming down with the ancient guillotine, and in the moment of contact, right? It's not just that he got him just before the knife came down. The knife came down, the neck turns into marble, That's how close Moshe was to being off. And in that moment, God saved me from Pharaoh's sword.
You know,
Go ahead. Yes.
The same thing happened with Esau and Yaakov's neck and the kissing and the biting and the whole thing.
Yes, right? So the rabbis love to imagine necks turning into things that cannot be penetrated when there is a cherub or teeth, right? That's on Vayishakehu. When Yaakov and Esau re-meet and there's dots over Vayishakehu, it means he kissed him. It wasn't that he kissed him, he bit him. And Yaakov's neck was turned to impenetrable. Tova.
Sorry. It's just interesting that this direction actually brings us back to the, I think it was Barry's comparison to Jonah, because it seems to be saying that one of the reasons he wasn't just fleeing for his life, he was fleeing from being the savior of this unworthy people of Malshinim. So it's very much the same thing as we see with Jonah.
Great. Because Jonah was concerned that the people he was going to be asked, he didn't deserve it.
They didn't deserve it.
Yeah, he'd rather die than give expiation for people who hadn't done tshuva. Right? Yeah. Yes, great stiff neck jokes. Terrific. Love it. Love it, love it, love it. Okay, we have gotten ourselves 2/3 of the way through a single Rashi. No, not even 2/3. 1/2 the way through a Rashi today. And it's 9:29. So when we meet next time, we'll deal with the Vayeshev. Those doubling of verbs that are the exact same in Hebrew, rendered into the exact same Aramaic, translated probably differently in most of our translations. Maybe next week we'll start with looking at several different translations of that in our book, and then see how Rashi serves to differentiate between those two. Last comment. Anyone want to have a last comment before we close the class? Next week, assuming it's not too hot, I'll be teaching from my sukkah. If you are blessed to be able to have a sukkah, I encourage you to be learning from your sukkah. And it's great to be back.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.